Kamala Harris is allying with Cheney, father, daughter, and mother. If we are concerned with American fascism, they are fascists.
We have very different views. I'm much more alarmed about a Trump win. The idea that we live in a very limited, shallow democracy is very, very consequential for the current election.
Can you please tell us about yourselves and your new book?
I'm Charlie Derber. I'm a teacher at Boston College in the sociology department since 1980, I think, going way back. Yale and I have written quite a number of books together. We're both people interested in the relation of politics and economics in particular, and how it also plays out in culture. This book, which is called Who Owns Democracy, I think is very topical. We thought it would be helpful for readers to get a perspective. I think a lot of people feel like this whole crisis of democracy that we're going through is new or invented by Trump. And our view is that if you take the long view, we're going through a set of political issues and economic issues which go way back to the beginning of the country. So I think what this book offers, in contrast to a lot of the other books on the election, is that it tries to put everything in historical context and show how the kinds of things we're dealing with today have deep roots all the way back to the beginning of the country, which I think will help people think about how to understand what's going on today. The other thing I just say is that we didn't, because it's a book about democracy, Yo and I write a lot of books together, but we thought we did a novel thing, which is the book is written in the form of a conversation. And the reason we did that is that we wanted readers to be able to understand where we agreed and where we disagreed, and that we could respectfully share our disagreements. And we thought that was a good model for democracy. So in a way, the book is written in a format that sort of allows differences to agree in the context of respect and belief that the reader should be able to make their decisions for themselves.
I was at UMass-Dartmouth for 46 years, since 1978. Believe it or not, going back many, many years ago, I was Charlie's student. But actually, he's still at Boston College, and I retired from UMass-Dartmouth very recently. This book is written as conversation because we do have agreements and disagreements, and we are certainly looking at how the current challenge to democracy, if that's what you want to call it, is very, very old. And we want to ask a question, when people talk about preserving our democracy, in what sense was ever democracy? Is that even a meaningful statement?
The book takes the point of view that while we have a kind of democracy, it's very, very limited, and it's significant. It permits civil liberties, it permits voting, but in terms of really hearing the voice of the people, our argument is that the subtitle of the book is The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. And our argument is that there's a kind of deep state. It's not exactly the deep state that Trump is talking about, although there's some overlap. But there have been, the deep state involves hierarchies involving big money or class, corporate power, and caste or racial and gender power, and other forms of power that are considered caste that go way back in the history of the country. So our argument is that, I think when Yo was saying, if you want to call it democracy, what he's saying is we've always had a society in which money and race and other factors have very much limited the voice of ordinary people. Most people don't have a lot of money. The majority are moving toward not being white and male. So all of this becomes part of the context for understanding what's going on today. And we think it offers a quite novel view. It also cross-cuts a lot of left-right perspective, because we think in many ways the Democratic ticket is offering some very traditional right-wing perspectives, particularly on war and foreign policy, but even on some worker and labor issues. So I think we have a set of perspectives that will be interesting to people because they don't follow along traditional stereotypical lines.
Trump and the right appear to have introduced the phrase deep state, but the left has long referred to the ruling class, the power elite, and the military-industrial complex. How do you differentiate between these things?
The ruling class is basically a Marxist term. It refers to the capitalist class, the owners of the means of production, the owners of economic institutions, the heads of corporations, and the dominant stockholders, the very rich, what Bernie Sanders and others call the 1%. They function in many ways as the real government, a shallow, hidden government that most people don't see. There's an official elected government, and as Charles pointed out, it has real power. It imposes certain limits. It, in some ways, represents the interest of ordinary people more than the corporation does. The corporation is openly called a fiduciary, which is legally accountable only to stockholders. They can actually sue if they put the interest of the public, the interest of the community, over the interest of the investors. They are designed to serve investors and no one else. The government is presumably designed to serve the people, however you define people. Now, there is the term power elite. The term power elite was introduced by a sociologist named C. Wright Mills in the 1950s. And he accepted the Marxist conception of ruling class, but he also wanted to point out it does not rule on its own. It has allies in the upper echelon of the state, especially in the military. There is the military-industrial complex, which one of its leaders, Dwight Eisenhower, both a five-star general and a president, also president of Columbia University, warned against.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
It was the focus of real power. It sets foreign policy. It is the main beneficiary of much investment. And the state is really designed to serve them. Now, there is Trump's deep state. Trump will include in his deep state institutions that we agree with. The security apparatus, designed to protect the United States, really designed to protect the corporations and their interests, the FBI, the CIA, the military itself. But he goes beyond that and talks about a larger deep state, which includes civil servants who are really trying to protect ordinary citizens, academics, intellectuals, journalists. And our understanding of the deep state really would not include them.
But I think the relevance of this to the current election is that polls are showing that there have been a lot of high quality polls recently, which are showing that about 50% or more over the last 10 years or so of ordinary Americans do believe that sort of behind the elected government, there is some sort of unelected group of people. Some people view this in very conspiratorial ways. Others just view it as a kind of like Eisenhower. He saw behind the elected officials. He talked about the military industrial complex, as Yale said. So, I mean, across the political spectrum, there's a view that the elected officials who are supposed to run the country in a democracy, since they're voted for by the people, are limited and in some cases are have less power. This is the view of the majority of ordinary Americans, than these unelected people, whether they're in the military industrial complex, whether they're people with, corporate CEOs or, private equity leaders with enormous amounts of money, people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. And so what we're arguing is that the idea of a deep state is, it's not simply a Trump invention. The idea has gone back on the right and the left for a very long time. But we think that, how this election is going to turn out depends partly on how people come to understand who are these unelected people? What is the nature of this kind of hidden power that exercises a great deal of influence over the economy, over the culture, and so forth. So the aim of our book, in a way, is to help people understand these different concepts of the deep state that go very far back. Maybe we can get into this a little bit, but at the very beginning of the country, and help people understand which of these concepts of the unelected state or the deep state is really more viable and more powerful in the way people think, because the way people will vote ultimately will depend. They want people to rule. They want ordinary people to rule. And so who these forces are, what these forces are that are sort of overshadowing the elected officials is very important to know if you're going to vote in this election, which we hope everybody will. So we're hoping that the book and our conversation today will help clarify these different views of a deep state or an unelected people, and help people sort this out to figure out who they really want to vote for.
Your book, Who Owns Democracy, is written as a conversation between both of you. Why did you take this approach?
Yale and I have written a lot of books together. We're both on the left-leaning side of the spectrum, but we have very different views. I'm much more alarmed about a Trump win than I think Yale is. We didn't want to suppress our differences for this. And we thought a conversational format would be helpful to readers because it would allow them to see that, even people who appear to be very similar have significant differences. And we wanted these differences to be obvious to people so that they felt they were hearing the real deal from us, that we weren't trying to create some sort of artificial thing that was manufactured for them or for our agreement. So we give a pretty much clear view in this book of our similarities and our differences.
As Charles said, we have agreements and disagreements, and we had to respect each other's opinions. And frankly, the way to do that would be to have a conversation where, in fact, we could express where we disagreed. And we do have certain differences in perspective. A good example is the possibility that Trump will once again be president. I am appalled that Kamala Harris is allying with Cheney, father, daughter, and mother. If we are concerned with American fascism, they are fascists in the literal sense of the word. They gave us the Patriot Act, which is a replica of Hitler's Enabling Act, which basically suspends the Constitution, suspends all civil liberties. Yes, there is risk of American fascism, but Trump is not the source of it, and it may or may not happen with or without fascism. And if Harris makes alliances with Cheney, she is inviting fascists into her administration.
Yeah, this is a good example where we disagree because, the Cheneys are highly militaristic. I share Yale's view that, if she were to make as some people have suggested, if Kamala were to win and make Liz Cheney Secretary of State, I think that would be horrific in terms of the effects on the world. And, Yale and I share a deep critique of American wars. But I don't think she's planning to make the Cheneys. What she's trying to do is reach out and sort of create a kind of very wide coalition to prevent, for anybody who is who wants to sustain and deepen democracy at home, understanding that Trump is a really, really serious threat to, as you know, it's sort of the election has been focused on January 6th and insurrection and all these attacks on democracy. And so I think she's bringing Cheney in, not because she wants to run the same foreign policy as the Cheneys, but because she's trying to get as broad a coalition as possible to try to, maintain whatever civil liberties and internal freedoms we can maintain in this country, which is very different. And so Yale feels that the reach out to Cheney's is dangerous and neo-fascist. My view is that she is genuinely trying to, I think, if she runs her foreign policy with a Cheney spirit and a neoconservative, reviving the neoconservative militarism, that would be a horrific outcome. It's different than eliminating democracy in the United States. And that's what I think Trump is. I think the voting, despite all the limitations of voting and civil liberties in our system right now, it's meaningful. And if Trump were elected, my view is that things would be much worse in terms of speech and voting rights and so forth. And so the other thing I just want to say about the conversational format is that people might say, oh, why to listen to these two guys just talking to each other? We did a lot of research in preparation for these conversations, and we've also worked very hard to edit them in a way that they're very easy to read. So this conversation is just not a random conversation between two guys who have studied this stuff for a while. It's a really carefully prepared book, which involves a lot of research, and people who have looked at it have been impressed by how easy it is to read in its conversational form. That was another thought in my mind, that people are used to hearing conversations, and this was so important that I think we felt that we might be able to draw people to read this more when it's like listening to a conversation. Like if the book is done as an audio book, it'd be actually done as a conversation, and conversations are easy to listen to.
You point out repeatedly that the deep state is not a monolith. There are ideological differences and often ethnic and religious tensions. One of the primary divisions is between elites who would prefer a caste system and those who want a class system. Can you please talk about this and explain the difference between caste and class?
Let me begin by comparing class and caste. Class is a group with a shared level of wealth and power. It is sometimes technically defined by Marx as a group that owns or controls the means of production, the dominant economic institutions. But rich, poor, working class, capitalist class, middle class, these are divisions of people who have certain levels of wealth and influence. And in capitalism, you theoretically can rise or fall in class. This is supposedly the land of opportunity, where any poor boy or poor girl can become rich and powerful. And in fact, we're hearing various politicians, including J.D. Vance and Kamala Harris herself, and Walz playing that up. Trump can't do that because he was born rich, but the others can. A caste is a fixed position in which you are born and can never change. In feudalism, you had a caste system where people were born royal, born noble, born common, and however you were born, that was fixed for life. Now let's talk. What's interesting is the so-called commons. You can look at the British House of Commons, which supposedly represents people without noble blood. But who's in the House of Commons? Bankers, industrialists, corporate lawyers, the very rich and very powerful. You can rule and be part of a lower caste. people who founded America were people who lacked caste status under feudalism. But many of them were very rich, very powerful, and in fact, some did come from the aristocracy. There was in the aristocracy this idea of primogeniture, where the oldest son inherits everything. The younger brothers and sisters moved to America and actually were the founders of many American fortunes, but they wanted to break from Britain. So they created this idea of equality, meaning we are all of one caste. We may all be of one caste, but we can still have vast differences of wealth and power. But you may be poor, I may be rich, but since we are the same caste, we are still commoners, we represent each other, we are equal. Now, the class system, especially in the South, excluded people of color. Slavery, which after slavery was abolished, became segregation, became Jim Crow. It was a caste-based system, which said they were inferior by virtue of their birth. So caste was maintained within American capitalism. American capitalism always has tension between class and caste.
Yeah, another way of putting this is that we make the argument in the book that actually the United States was founded as a troubled marriage that would eventually end in divorce between two deep states, or sort of emergent deep states. One is sort of represented the merchants who were in the North, who were the earliest American capitalists and were sort of basing their view of the future and their own power on their money and their economic fortunes, and wanted to build a capitalist society. So that was the northern deep state, which was a corporate capitalist deep state, which we think rules the country today. The South was very different, as Yale suggests. It was a deep state that had a vision of the country based around the idea of caste rather than class. And so Jefferson, despite his noble democratic ideals, never thought, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, or 40 years later when he died, he never believed that blacks could be part of a genuine American democracy, because he felt the castes, that people of color were just so different from white people that you couldn't have a viable country. And so you had two, when the country was formed, you had two different parts of the United States, the capitalist North and the slave South, that represented two very different ideas of how to organize society and how to organize the politics. And one was based on money and class, and one was based on caste and largely on race. And the differences between these two deep states became more and more severe in the next 50 years after the Revolution. And it ended up in the Civil War, where basically class and caste went to war with each other in terms of the vision of the future. And they then reconciled when, after 1876, a compromise was made. The North pulled out and allowed the caste forces of the South in Jim Crow to resurrect themselves, but not in the federal, fully running the federal government anymore, which was going to be dominated by the new industrialists, Rockefeller, Carnegie, so forth of the Gilded Age. So the federal government was taken over by the northern capitalist idea of class and the people who represented it. But what I call fascist ghosts, I should say the caste idea of the original founding Southern gentry, was what we call American fascism, because it represented, just to sort of introduce this idea of fascism, which sounds like hyperbole, Hitler was very, very fascinated by American race theory and American politics. His notion of fascism, and he instructed his German scientists were told by Hitler to come to the United States and study American race theory and American eugenics, which was because he admired the way the South had sort of built its identity around this kind of caste-based system, which is really a way of talking about fascism, classical European fascism. And so it's sort of interesting that the American caste system, which we talk about as a kind of American version of fascism, really preceded European fascism. It preceded the Mussolinis and the Hitlers, and the Hitler learned a lot from American fascism. So, and the reason I'm highlighting this is that there's so much discussion of Trump and fascism today, and the idea that Trump somehow is inventing something completely new with this very authoritarian kind of politics that he's running. And what we try to trace in the book is the long lineage of American far-right kind of fascist forces and politics, which started in the American South and then got revived after the Civil War in Jim Crow and has lasted through the entire history of the country. Reagan revived a version of what I think Trump would try to do today, which is to reunite, sort of in the spirit of the original founding, the class power of capitalism with the caste power of race. And so Reagan was elected very much representing big corporations and this capitalist ideal going global with capitalism. But he also built on white Christian nationalism culturally and sort of tried to integrate his idea of global capitalism with a kind of white Christian nationalism. And Trumpism is very much in the spirit of Reagan's, how Reagan adapted, this long history of class and caste in America. So our argument is that what Trump is representing today is sort of an extreme and more authoritarian version. You and I have some differences about this, but my view is that Trump is basically reintegrating the kind of forces of big money and capital, which were very central to the North, and the ideas of white nationalism and caste, which were very central to the South. And Trump sounds very confusing because sometimes he sounds like just a big capitalist, and sometimes he sounds like a racist and somebody who is simply echoing traditional Southern racial ideas. In fact, just as like the beginning of the country, it's possible to try to build a society that integrates these two things. In fact, as we argue, way back at the beginning of the country, it was difficult. It was an unhappy marriage, but it was possible to build a ruling, elite that integrated capitalist values and great capitalist fortunes with caste-based power based in the slave system and the vision of an agrarian kind of society that was built in the South. So we see Trump as, in a strange way, he's not as novel as some people say. This very authoritarian melding of money, big money, and racial white Christian nationalism goes right back to the beginning of the country. And that's one of the reasons when people say, why do so many people who don't understand why is Trump so attractive when he seems to be so clearly opposition to the democratic traditions of the country? What we show in the book is that, in fact, he's representing ways of thinking about American politics and democracy that go right back to the beginning of the country. Now, we have other ideas that have to do, which I'm sure we'll get into, about identity politics, that the Democrats basically have moved away from the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt during the Depression, and the emphasis on class, which really built the modern 20th century Democratic Party and built a majority of working class people supporting Democrats because they thought Democrats were challenging corporate class power to serve working people. People are going to decide this election in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those people were all for the Democrats because they saw Democrats not representing racial privilege or anything like that. They are attacking them for racial privilege, but rather trying to basically bring people of different races together to who are working people, whatever their race or gender, to counter the power of big corporations. And Democrats since the end of the New Deal, have lost all these Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania blue-collar workers who have been migrating for decades now, ever since the end of the New Deal, toward the Republicans. And this is the other huge reason why we think Trump has so much appeal, because the Democrats are no longer offering the white working people, who are about 50% of the voting population. White, non-college people are about 50% of the American voter. And the Democrats have kind of abandoned those people because they've moved over to say, we're the party of people of color, of women, and those are all important people, obviously, to represent. But when you abandon those people in the name of, saying, well, our basic focus is on race and gender, and we're no longer really going to center on dealing with the great crises of capitalism that New Deal Democrats tried to do in the 30s during the Great Depression, you lose the election. You lose those blue-collar voters in the blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And so we have a very serious critique of the Democrats in their failure to advance a class politics, which is very critical of big money and of corporate power and of the militarism and wars, which basically serve the corporate elites who want a powerful United States to open up markets around the world where they can make more profit off of cheap labor and no corporate taxes and no unions. And so the Democrats, we feel, have abandoned white working class and the whole idea of looking at the meaning of what is a democracy when you have a corporate power elite which goes unchallenged by either party. Trump sometimes sounds like he's attacking global corporations, but in fact, he's in bed with them. He's getting funding from them. He is a voice of the corporate rich. And so I can understand why working people are very discouraged about their prospects, because they've been abandoned in many ways by both parties. And our book is an argument that the Democratic Party bears a lot of responsibility for this, and that they have to really take seriously the idea that the majority of Americans are suffering a great deal from the economic and the money spent on wars that the corporations have advanced. So we have a very severe critique of Trump, but we also have a very strong critique of the Democrats and an argument that you have to come back to a challenge, go beyond this identity politics, which only focuses on race and gender, and really challenge the stranglehold of big money on most people in the country.
What is the difference between shallow democracy and deep democracy?
So this is really a continuation of what we've been talking about, that the history of America prides itself as a democratic society. And we've shown in this history of the country that it's always been a very, very weak democracy. It is true there's been voting and there are civil liberties, and that makes a big difference. But, at the very beginning of the country, there was almost no voting. Slaves obviously didn't vote. Women didn't have the right to vote. And most poor white men could not vote either. There was hardly any voting. Now, this expanded over time, but it was always very restricted. And because of the power of big money, which began to become overwhelmingly strong after the Civil War with the rise of the Rockefellers and the Morgans and the Carnegies and so forth, the power of big money, even though more people got to vote, the power of big money limited the ability of ordinary people to have any real votes. The amount of lobbying and the buying of candidates, which is one of the historical Supreme Court decisions we put a lot of attention on is the Santa Clara Act of 1876. That sort of preceded the Citizens United Act that people know about today. It said that corporations are constitutionally people and that corporate money should be understood as free speech. What that did was set the groundworks legally. We worry about the Supreme Court today, but if you're a liberal person, you worry about the Supreme Court. But if you lived like 150 years ago, you would be worried very much about the Supreme Court right after the Civil War, because the Supreme Court was basically beginning changing the legal constitutional structure of the land to empower corporations as essentially constitutional persons with rights of unlimited money in the name of free speech to pour into the political system. So shallow democracy, it reflects the legal and political history of the United States, which has basically allowed money to silence the voice of ordinary people. So we have what we mean by a shallow democracy is a democracy in which money controls most of what government does. Now, deep democracy is when people have enough control over their economic life as well as the vote to make the vote matter. So in the Depression, you began to get, it was not legal to have unions in America until 1935, the Wagner Act. And so you began to get, during the 30s, Roosevelt allowed almost 45% of American workers were unionized. Today, it's down to 5% in the private sector. In Europe, it's 70% of workers are unionized. This is when, 100 billionaires have more wealth than 90% of the American population. So the lack of organized power by workers, it spells shallow democracy. It spells the end of a real political voice, because even though workers can vote, both parties, I sometimes call them Bush and Bush Light, are representing corporate power. And that's a sheer and pure sign of shallow democracy. And our book lays out what it would look like to imagine and see a kind of collective power organized through working or class-based organizations, whether it's unions or cooperatives or labor parties that exist in much of the world, in Europe and so forth. That America is wired in this hardwired in this very corporate way that keeps the voice of ordinary people. Even though we call ourselves a democracy, the voice of ordinary people is drowned out by the sound of all that money, which is jingling around in Elon Musk's pocket and going right now into literally hundreds of millions of dollars, paying for ads in the swing states and paying for the door knockers and the phone calls and some of the guns that are going to be around the election sites where people are going to be voting this year. So it's, the idea that we live in a very limited, shallow democracy is very, very consequential for the current election.
You take a deep dive into the history of the deep state and how it developed in the U.S. Can you give us a sense of this? How did the deep state take root, and how has it recreated itself throughout our history?
Now the question is, was there ever not a deep state? From the very, very beginning, as we already said, very rich people, many of whom were heavily engaged in the slave trade, were the founding fathers, the creators of our democracy. And was the American Revolution really a revolution? If you name the leaders in America before the Revolution, you have names like Franklin, Jefferson, Washington. Names afterwards, you have names like Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, the exact same people. What really changed? But as we said before, they used democratic language to justify their rule, and they said to so-called common people, we are equal, we are the same as you, we represent you, which they very much did not. They were the exploiters. They were people who paid very low wages, created workhouses, early factories, and of course in the South, they were slave owners. Now, as we've already pointed out, prior to the Civil War, there were two deep states that tried to coexist, but they had very different interests. And the Civil War was really a battle over who was to control the federal government. Prior to the Civil War, the federal government was more or less in the hand of Southern slave owners, Southern proto-capitalists. They were crushed in the Civil War, and the federal government then represented what was now emerging Northern industrialists, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans. In the book, we have a cartoon from the period where these giant robber barons, these giant, very, very rich people, enter the Senate chamber and throw money at tiny senators. So it's very clear who is in charge, who really rules. And as Charlie points out, that was known for a very, very long time. There were people who never took seriously the idea that we indeed do live in a democracy. We live in an oligarchy controlled by the very, very rich. Now, the Southern residues of the peasant class always said the South will rise again. They never forgave the North for the Civil War. They never really accepted the fact that they were going to be ruled by the industrialists and the financiers. And they created in the South, and now slavery was illegal, what's sometimes called Jim Crow, what can be called apartheid, what can be called segregation, a caste system where, in fact, many ex-slaves became sharecroppers, where they were essentially equivalent of feudal serfs and did not live all that differently than they did as slaves. And they were clearly given second caste, I was going to say second class, but really second caste status of inferiority. In the period we're talking about, as the United States was becoming a major industrial power, Europe was busy finding colonies in Africa and East Asia. The United States claimed half the world, all Latin America, essentially as its empire, as its domain. And of course, it extracted huge sums of money from that. But the United States maintained a relatively modest military until World War I. And in both World Wars, the United States went from having a modest military to the world's largest in barely a year. I repeat, both happened in both World Wars. At the end of the First World War, the United States clearly emerged as the world's richest economy. The British and French empires were weakened, but still powerful enough to police the so-called undeveloped world to protect American corporate interests. After the Second World War, the British and French empires were now so weak that they could no longer be the world police force. The United States made a discovery. There's gold in them their wars. So the United States decided to maintain a full-scale war economy ever since World War II. And you build an infrastructure based on armaments. Armaments became America's staple product. It still is. The United States still has by far the world's largest military. The United States is still the world's largest economy, but economically much less so. At the end of World War II, the United States owned approximately 50% of world GDP. Now the United States owns 20% of world GDP. Still the largest, but proportionally much smaller. By the early 1970s, coincidentally, the exact same time the United States lost in Vietnam, Europe, Japan had recovered from the world wars. They had rebuilt their economy, but not their military. They started thinking, hey, we really don't need a military. All the military did was bring us world wars, misery, and destruction. So let's focus on improving the quality of domestic life. The United States didn't do that. The United States, for a while, provided its people with the world's highest standard of living. No longer the case. It was the world's highest standard of living, but it was based on armament industries. So you have a state completely dependent upon warfare, completely dependent upon armaments, and really not meeting the needs of its own people. So the deep state became a permanent fixture in the form of the military-industrial complex. And I want to point out that we can talk about all the domestic achievements of Roosevelt during the New Deal, and they're very, very real. But it was during during World War II, during Roosevelt's presidency, that the deep state as we know it really came into its own and really assumed the power it now has.
And just to add on a little bit to the bringing this up to date, this election right now, the outcome may rest on Michigan and the fact that a lot of young people and Arab Americans are seeing the American military deep state, the military-industrial complex, leading to massive support for an escalating war in the Middle East that is pretty much destroying the Palestinian people and is very possibly going to lead to Michigan flipping over from support for the Democrats in 2020 to supporting Trump in 2024. It's ironic that Trump is seen as the peace candidate. In a way, he is the peace candidate in Ukraine, because I think if he were elected, the war in Ukraine would be settled through a territorial compromise fairly quickly. I don't think it would be peaceful in the Middle East at all. I think Trump would give a green light to complete destruction of the Palestinian population and more, probably a war with Iran. But I think one of our critiques is that when Yale was highlighting the historical turn and development of the deep state, the capitalist deep state, toward a war state, it's become today an overwhelming dimension of the power elite in the United States. We are committed to global military power, global military sales, global military policing. And the Democrats have largely embraced this extremely sort of imperial, hegemonic world power role for the United States. And it's depleting funds for workers at home, and it's depleting the ability of America. Much of American warfare has gone to supporting dictators and authoritarian powers, whether it's in, Central America or in parts of Africa or parts of Asia, where our military interventions, the last time we went in and supported an intervention in Iran was in 1953, and that was to eliminate a democracy that existed by a guy named Mossadegh, who was trying to be neutral in the Cold War, and the CIA brought in a military power in Iran, which led to back to the Shah, and then led to the revolution that we're dealing with Iran today. So our concern is that the Democrats, again, have bought into a kind of corporate militarism, which is very dangerous for the world and very dangerous for democracy. Now, I did want to add to this. People who are listening to this are saying these guys are just unrelentingly negative about America and about American power and democracy. And we are unsparing in trying to speak truth as we see it about the limits to American democracy, whether by big money or by racial or gender grounds. On the other hand, I want to point out that much of this book is also, despite all the limitations and hypocrisy of the people who created the American Revolution and basically put a white male, rich elite back into power, America has always taken, ordinary Americans have taken seriously the idea, even though Jefferson never practiced it. He was very articulate. The founders were very persuasive in developing an idea of democracy that was put into the Declaration of Independence, that Americans took seriously as a national creed, even though it was never put into practice, even remotely. But what we show in this book is right alongside all of this wielding of autocratic, military, and anti-democratic, racial and corporate power that we document throughout American history. There's also been a never giving up quality to the ability and capacity of ordinary Americans to say, wait a minute, even if we're not experiencing it, we really believe in this idea that people should rule, and that big money or racial or gender differences should not be blocking the ability of ordinary people. So this book includes all the movements for what we call deep democracy. There's been a long history of Americans organizing to move from this shallow, very limited, money-driven kind of democracy, if you want to call it that, to a deeper economic control by ordinary workers over both black and white and brown and male and female, coming together to say, wait a minute, this country, the land of this country and the wealth of this country was built by ordinary people. Where does American wealth come from? It comes from ordinary people who work, 3 jobs and do the labor that has really made it possible to build all this great wealth that so many of us have privileged to be living in today. So the history of that struggle, which includes populists against the robber barons in the 1890s, it includes the Wobblies in the early 20th century, who were global labor activists. It includes the Socialist Party that was against the war in World War I, and where Eugene Debs ran from jail and got over 1 million votes for president in 1916. It includes all the wildcat strikes and labor union organizing of the 1930s. It includes the anti-war and anti-poverty and civil rights activism of the 1960s and 70s, all the way up to Occupy Wall Street, and today to all of the kinds of anti-racist and labor mobilization. The summer of 2023 was the biggest summer of labor organizing since 1963. We're seeing labor organizing in the South. We had some successful unions being in Tennessee and the auto companies that we have. We have a revived labor movement that's struggling for what we call deep democracy, which is a democracy in which people take control of the means of production, of the capital, of the big money that has been operating against the people of America, where people say, wait a minute, we produce this wealth. We have a right to have some voice over how that wealth is controlled, owned, and spent. And so even though much of what we're saying must sound very pessimistic to most people, the book has an element of hope, which is based not on just faith, but on the actual history of struggle. And despite all the power of class and caste that we document all through the book, we also document that ordinary Americans, whether organizing against class or against caste or both, have developed very important movements in the name of American ideals, which were never really put into practice, but which have really shaped the identity of the country in terms of what people thought of themselves as being as Americans. So we feel like, in that sense, the book is much more hopeful than we sound, probably, because we really argue that there is a long history of autocracy and sort of fascism in America, but there's also a long history of struggle for deep democracy, which is very meaningful and still has real possibility. We whether it's in the climate movement with the young people who are struggling against gun violence, or we're just worried about how to get a good job, and the rise of the labor movement today, we think there's lots of possibility that's still to be realized. And this election is so crucial because those struggles are going to be under great threat if Trump wins, whereas we think that Democrats, despite all the limitations we've been talking about, which are very severe, we believe that at least there's the possibility of really moving these struggles to a new level of deep democracy if we can move forward after this election.
How has the deep state been challenged by various movements? How have these movements succeeded and failed, and why?
It's important in the current election how much labor is able to play an active role. I mean, the election is going to turn, in my judgment, on how blue-collar voters, mostly in those 3 blue wall states, vote. And that's going to be determined by how much the labor unions that represent those workers who feel their jobs are, being exported, and Trump has tapped into their anxiety because the Democrats have not been protecting those workers for reasons that I've mentioned before. The Democratic Party embracing sort of racial, the Democratic Party sort of says to these workers in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, hey, you guys, if you're white, you're part of a white privilege operating against black people or brown people and so forth. And that's not going to cut it with those workers. Those workers deserve to hear the full story. And that full story is that the corporate powers that be are truly making their lives insecure for the long term. Their jobs, their futures are at serious risk. And the Democratic Party has not, because it's moved toward a caste, kind of politics, it's no longer representing the class interests, the economic, financial interests of ordinary people that are central to how this election is going to turn out. And so our history of the challenges to the deep state, there really does take a serious look at when in the past have working people been so afraid and so, have reason to be so concerned about their economic future, their jobs, their wages, their competitions from abroad. And we show that, there were even farmers back in the 1880s and 90s were organizing villages, sort of people like themselves, or people speaking like me in Yale, who would go to various villages to talk about the way in which Wall Street at the time was, hiking up interest rates and restricting the money supply in a way that was basically starving out farmers, in that period of history. And you had a People's Party in 1892, a new party created that was trying to challenge the control of Wall Street over the whole economic system, early Wall Street, the Morgan Empire. And that Democratic Party took that over and pretty much watered it down in 1896. But I mention this simply because the insecurity of ordinary Americans in the face of financial concentration of power has lasted for the whole history of the country. And we're in a period now when more money is concentrated in a tiny group of people, the 1% of the 1%. This is the 1/10 of the 1%, who basically, Elon Musk is on track to be the first person in the world's history to be a trillionaire. And we have a tiny fraction of people, a class of multi-billionaires. You can read about them in the Fortune, 400, who are accumulating wealth. There are like 5 people that have more in America, billionaires, who have more money than all the money in Africa, all the wealth of people in Africa put together, for example. And some of those countries are developing. But the inequality and the power of money has never been as concentrated. And yet, all through American history, the power of big money, certainly since the end of the Civil War and the building of the empires created by Carnegie. Remember, American capitalism in its modern form started with big oil, with Mr. Rockefeller, who built the oil companies of America. And that's led us, the descendants of those companies are Exxon and Chevron and, going southwest to the Koch brothers. These are enormous concentrations of power. I call them the carbon industrial complex. They're they wield enormous power over American energy. And that started right in with Rockefeller in the 150 years ago, and people began to rise up against that. Now with the climate movement, in addition to the economic issues, it's a much bigger thing. And then there's the financial empire that J.P. Morgan built. He had to bail the country out in 1907 when the country went into a Great Depression. And then, many years later, America would bail out the Morgan Empire and other financial after the recession that the Wall Street created in 2008, when they basically went into marketing, junk bonds and cheap, mortgages that would never be repaid. The country financially collapsed. And what happened? The people who lost their homes were poor people who never got their homes back. But the Lehman Brothers, the financial houses that financed all this, and they were bailed out by the American government, and that led to Occupy Wall Street and to these movements that began to challenge the power of these huge global companies. And it's interesting that about a supermajority of Americans, about 80 to 90% of both Republicans and Democrats, say big money is a curse on the politics of this country. They see that people like the billionaires in Silicon Valley that put J.D. Vance into power in the Republican Party, or the people who are funding both Democrats and Republicans who are on Wall Street today, like Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan Chase. There's now horrendous anger of ordinary people. My view is that Trump's popularity is largely because he's tapped into that anger of ordinary people about their economic fates and their feeling of loss of economic security and loss of reasonable wages. And he's made himself the champion of the, quote, forgotten worker. And that could only take place when the Democrats had moved away from its concern with class, as it was through most of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, toward when Bill Clinton jumped on the Reagan freight train and said, well, we're now, we're part of this global capitalism and we're going to ride that train wherever it goes. And what that led to was the workers of America migrate, the blue collar workers, particularly white workers, migrating out of the Democratic Party into the Republican. That is the biggest earthquake in American politics. And that's why Trump is riding as high as he is. People ask, how could Trump, who's so obviously old, losing coherence and cognitive capacity, is where Biden was before Biden dropped out. And yet they say, why is Trump, having such strength at the polls? And the answer to me is pretty clear. He's riding the anger that people feel about being abandoned to the power, the class powers, the corporate powers that have gone global and abandoned ordinary workers. But again, the hope is that you're seeing a revival of labor movements, across the country, which are beginning to gain victories in parts of the country that we didn't think, and it's interesting that the labor movement is now, like in parts of the early 20th century, they're not simply organizing for collective bargaining gains for their own members. In other words, this is not just about, I want a little more money for my wage. That's important, given, the minimum wage in the United States, believe it or not, is still $7.25, right? What kind of family or worker can live on that, even if they're working 2 or 3 jobs, right? It just can't be done. So I'm not disparaging the importance of bargaining for wages, but the bigger unions are now looking more at the structure of the economy as a whole and saying, wait a minute, we don't need just more wages for our workers. We need more wages for all workers, and we need more control of the overall economy. What's going global? What are the regulations on the environment and so forth? And that requires a bigger issue about who's going to control the government, which is a democracy issue, and who's going to control economic policy about what goes global, what stays at home, and so forth. And it's interesting and important that right now, labor unions are beginning to move from this more narrow, Cold War kind of ideology that it says, on the one hand, we're going to support American wars, and second, we're going to just support the wages of our own members. They're saying, no, now we know that if we raise the wages of our own members, the wages of all people in America will be improved, which is true. There's a very strong correlation between when a union wins for more money for its members, the wage levels of the entire country tend to go up historically. And labor has begun for the first time. This is very different than when I was challenging the Vietnam War back in the 60s and 70s. The labor movement was all for the American, was against the anti-war movement, was in favor of for the war or against the anti-war protesters. Today, the labor movement, like people like Shawn Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers, is challenging American war in the Middle East, for example. He's arguing that we need to cut back on this, terrible spreading war, which is the October surprise. What's going to happen in the next few weeks is Trump's final card, Trump card, so to speak, is seeing a larger war in the Middle East, which I think Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, is desperate to see Trump win. And he thinks that the best way to see Trump win is to see oil prices rise. So I think that Netanyahu is likely in the next few weeks to strike oil fields in Iran that could have global economic consequences. So right in the next few weeks before the election, there's always an October surprise. The October surprise might well be a spike in global oil prices that would turn a very close election to Trump potentially, as people are paying higher prices generally because of an expanded, escalated war in the Middle East. So, but the hope again is that labor movements are beginning to challenge this kind of warfare. People like Shawn Fain, the teachers union, the nurses union, they're really speaking out for a broader vision of a society that's working for ordinary people and for democracy, not just for a little more wages for their own members. And so I think that's a really hopeful sign that we're seeing the revival of a different kind of labor movement that is no longer in bed with the war state and is no longer in bed with corporations, to be truthful. I mean, they're really challenging the idea that corporations should control. If you listen to, a lot of these unions are tied in with the progressives like Bernie Sanders, who are arguing for a real challenge to the entire corporate system. They want to see a different kind of economic order. And a lot of these unions are very close to Shawn Fain or AOC, these other very progressive Democrats who are speaking up for a different kind of economic order. And our book shows that voice for a different kind of economy, where working people have much more control over money, that you've seen the revival of that struggle over and over again. So I have optimism that it can still rise and gain a lot of power.
The military-industrial complex figures heavily in your book, especially when you discuss the post-World War II years. How did the military-industrial complex strengthen the deep state, and what role has it played in creating the consumer culture that first flourished in the 1950s?
In the 1950s, as I pointed out a few minutes ago, the United States had half of the world GDP. And there was a problem of underconsumption. The United States was producing, but its people were not buying. So you had this push for planned obsolescence, where you had to have the latest car, and the car models would change every year. Your neighbor could see you weren't with it if you wouldn't have the newest car. There was this push in the GI Bill to encourage home ownership. Suburbs emerged. Inner cities were deliberately destroyed to get people to buy. And this was, of course, all generated by the prosperity that was produced by military spending. You had an economy whose staple industry was armaments. But of course, what's the markets for armaments? So you had to subsidize ordinary consumers, and wages during this period really did rise. Standard of living, at least material standard of living, really did improve. But it was done in a way that ended up destroying infrastructure. It ended up destroying downtowns, ended up destroying inner cities. Roads were built. People became more spread out, became more dependent upon cars. It was, in the long run, environmentally destructive, and of course, it also led to building arsenals capable of destroying the world many times over. But it produced a short-term prosperity, and I emphasize short-term, because while the United States was busy building this weapon industry, The other side of World War II, which had been completely devastated, also began to rebuild using American military technology. The same technology that was used in America to build missiles and bombs, in Europe, Japan was used to build cameras, televisions, and of course, the difference in cars. American cars were deliberately built to fall apart, look pretty, consume lots and lots of gasoline. European cars and Japanese cars were built to be small, fit in easy parking spaces, use less gas, more economic to run. Now, the irony is Americans wanted foreign cars and foreigners did not want American cars. So there was a shift in prosperity. By the early 1970s, Europe and Japan was pretty much recovering from the total devastation of World War II, using American military technology, but using that technology to improve the quality of civilian life, which did not happen in the United States. The American corporation saw itself in relative decline, emphasized relative, because it was still very prosperous. What did it do? It attacked the standard of living of the American people. There had been a détente between, as Kathy and Charlie pointed out, between unions and corporations, where the corporations said, let us run the world and we'll give our people prosperity. But by 1970, they decided that prosperity was interfering with their profit. And they started closing down factories, moving to the third world, moving to Singapore, Thailand, Mexico, and ironically, eventually, Vietnam and Cambodia. They became the places where American factories were being built, and they not exactly give prosperity to the people who live there, but they undermine the standard of living of ordinary Americans. And we're in fact seeing that decline and the rise of Trumpism, and I say Reaganism, and I want to emphasize, I don't understand the distinction people make between Reagan and Trump. I think Trump is Reagan's direct heir. If anything, Reagan's foreign policy was worse than Trump. He was more aggressive, more militaristic, yes and may. That shift was a response to an attack upon the American standard of living of ordinary people. Now, the funny thing is, people who are destroying their livelihood and turn against people who even poorer than them, people really were victims, and they were seen as the perpetrators.
And another element that I think is not widely understood of Yale's excellent point there is that the turn to militarism, which is sort of the modern form of the deep state, a highly military dominated kind of corporate deep state, it has great implications for not only for wages and the livelihood of most American people, but in the way that just Yale documented, but also in the environmental standards, because when you move toward militarism as your primary, your primary capital investment has to do with maintaining the infrastructure of the military and economic infrastructure of global capitalism. It has enormous effects on the environment as well as on the domestic economy. What I think most, every year the Pentagon is asked, what is the largest national security threat to the United States? And for the last few years, they've always had the same answer: climate change. The Pentagon has said that what's going to happen is that about 60% of the world lives near the coast, within 50 miles of the coast. You see it in places like Bangladesh. As the waters rise, millions of people lose land, and they need to move. And where are they going to go? They're going to have to fight other places to get inhabitable land. That's happening in Florida. It's happening around the world, that people are seeing scarce land as climate change rises. What the Pentagon doesn't tell you, that the biggest the carbon emitter that emits more carbon than any other institution in the world is the Pentagon. The Pentagon, so war comes out of climate change, but climate change, in other words, it forces people to move and to compete with each other for more scarce land and resources. But climate change, war also drives climate change, because fighting wars and producing weapons for wars is enormously carbon and methane intensive. First of all, it's very aviation based, in the air, just the training flights and the kind of preparation for training the military is just incredibly carbon intensive in terms of flying. If I fly once to Europe, I'm using up my appropriate, if I'm a green person concerned about climate, I'm using up my climate quota by one time. But the military is flying flights like that every day, hour by hour. And then the production of tanks and airplanes, the construction of military bases, all that construction is enormously carbon intensive. We're not building people's homes here. We're building bases, military bases. The United States is the only country that has about 1,000 military bases around the world. An American soldier can get almost anywhere in the world within seconds, because Americans can, through a global naval infrastructure, can reach anywhere. All of this has not only great implications for the diversion of American capital from building for the American worker at home to building for, the military abroad, but it has enormous implications for the future of the planet, because not only are we facing the possibility of a war going nuclear in the Middle East or in, around NATO and Russia, but, climate change that is going to be uncontrollable as the American military continues to emit this much carbon into the environment and produce. So we're seeing there's sort of what I call a triangle of extinction, which is a relation between capitalism, think of capitalism on top, climate change and environmental death on one side, and war and militarism on the other. Those are all intertwined and connected. And so the deep state is becoming an extinction state. It's becoming the military drive of the deep state is dangerous for not only dangerous for the American worker, and it's dangerous for the survival of the planet. And I don't think there's enough understanding of how much these existential threats of climate change and nuclear war are connected to each other and to the economic system, that it's very profitable. Yale talked about there's gold in them there are wars. Well, there's not so much gold in wars that lead to nuclear extinction or to environmental destruction, and that's what we're facing right now. And I think, again, I think the importance of this election and the despair of many people is they understand that all these crises are happening at once, and they don't see either party really responding, certainly to the war threat. And it's not clear whether the Democrats are going to be able to respond. I think Biden has been surprisingly good on domestic economic issues related particularly to the environment and dealing with climate change. But how the Harris administration will be on those issues is still a little bit. She came out and said, "Well, I'm no longer support a ban on fracking." Fracking is an effort, it's because she's really worried about Pennsylvania, and fracking is a major part of the Western Pennsylvania economy to release more natural gas in that area. Fracking is by far the most dangerous emitter of methane, which is the most dangerous fossil fuel. And so people are understandably seeing what she's supporting and saying, can we trust that the Democrats are going to really be very, very ambitious about trying to create a kind of green new infrastructure which will create millions of new good jobs, which are also sustainable jobs. I mean, I think that is the future. And a deep democracy is going to coalesce around this idea of a Green New Deal that will, like the old New Deal, will be focused on challenging the unchecked power of corporations, challenging the carbon industrial complex and the military industrial complex, and create an economy that is going to be survivable and still create good jobs for all. That's the hope. And there are plenty of Democrats on the Hill that want to support that. But whether the Harris campaign is going to be able to mobilize the population clearly in support of that agenda, I think is incredibly important. If she can speak to that, if she can align with, in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, with these workers that will see their futures in good green jobs that are not tied to military production and are tied to reviving the environment, I think that she will win. And she has a month to really make clear that a kind of democratic Green New Deal of a deeper democracy, where workers are involved because they want the money of the country that they built, the wealth of the country, going into survivable investment, which will actually sustain their families and their children and their grandchildren for decades to come. And that's only going to happen with some variant of a Green New Deal, which both creates millions of new jobs, which are survivable in the long way, which means pulling the money out of the military industrial complex and out of the carbon industrial complex and being put into these survivable jobs that the people of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are desperate to build. That will be the vehicle for winning this election.
You use the term fascist ghosts often in the book. What do you mean by this, and do the ghosts go beyond the American South?
I had mentioned much earlier that we saw American fascism beginning with the South, the slave state, which Hitler took great interest, as I said before. European fascism took a lot of interest from there. And so after the Civil War, the South was defeated, but fascism maintained a presence. Literally the Ku Klux Klan, the people put on those white, and they looked a little bit like ghosts, right? Well, those are fascist ghosts. They are resurrecting the kind of ideology of caste and racial exclusion, racial extermination. Remember, even Jefferson felt that Black people could not live indefinitely in the United States. They would have to be going back to Africa, living separately. So that idea of sort of extermination, at least extermination from the United States itself, was built in, to the founding of the country. And so that's why this kind of, if you think of fascism as kind of racial extermination, which has become such a long history in the United States, that it's not, the fascist ghosts are very much still alive. I mean, if Trump wins the election, the white Christian nationalist forces are very much a legacy of, and a continuation, maybe an intensification of the kind of racial exclusion and maybe racial extermination. He's talking about deportation of 20 million people, rounding them up, putting them in camps that might not look all that different from the concentration camps in Germany, and basically sending them back as rapidly as possible using the American military. Many of them will be American citizens or, legal asylums who will be sent back. If you look at that picture, which is all spelled out in Project 2025 in great detail, we know the personnel, we know what kind of armed forces, military forces, National Guard forces, police forces are going to be used to round up these 20 million people, put them in camps. Our version, we did it during the Japanese in World War II. We're going to do it to immigrants today. I mean, Trump is running a campaign of hatred and extermination of immigrants, and which is really a code language for exterminating the racial other. And that is about as close to the concept of fascism as you can get. So, I mean, that's where this election really will make a difference. I mean, the Democrats have a very different approach to, they're trying to be tough on immigrants. They tried to pass the most conservative immigration bill that James Lankford, the Oklahoma senator, had put forward. Trump said, don't pass it to the Republicans because he wanted to run on immigration. Why did he want to run on immigration? Because he knows these racial extermination kinds of agendas have such a long resonance to American workers, particularly when they're suffering and they're being told that they're privileged because of all the benefits going to these other people of different races. So that's why fascist ghosts are fluttering around us with a lot of intensity. And again, why this election is so important, because these fascist ghosts are going to become real fascism, in my judgment. if Trump wins this election.
The so-called fascist ghosts can be traced back to the very beginning of this country. Country was founded in slavery, country founded in genocide, and of course you had the Civil War, you had, as Charles Lee mentioned, the Ku Klux Klan. You always had very powerful far-right movements, and frankly, the populists were heavily involved in those far-right movements. There always was a sense of who can be and who is not a true American. And certain people fundamentally do not belong, and they must be expunged, they must be expelled. Now, if you talk to people about welfare, you will get simultaneously, out of the same breath, two completely contradictory statements. They are lazy and they want our jobs. They're being told these un-Americans, people who are basically don't belong here. They are coming in, infiltrating. They are kind of vermin. And of course, vermin is the term Hitler himself used, who are infecting the American body. They must be expunged. They must be purged. These ideas are not new. These ideas have permeated American culture, I would say, probably since 1620, let alone 1776.
Yeah, and this is the intertwining of caste, like one of the leading concepts of our book, and fascism, that caste politics, that it's as it's historically developed in the United States, has been so associated with dividing the country by those who belong, the true Americans, and those who don't. Remember, the true Americans would never included the Native Americans, the people who, this land belonged to for thousands of years. America, the great Democrat Andrew Jackson was arguably one of the most fascist presidents in American history, because he basically exterminated and provided a legitimation for destroying Native Americans and Native American control. So
we have manifest destiny. God or some higher force gave us this land. They don't belong here. They're supposed to be eliminated. And of course, you bring in people from Africa when you wipe out the Native Americans to do the work of the population, but they must be kept in their past position.
And Trump is so outspoken on this. He literally says, we're letting in people from the Congo, these quote shitholes, if I can use that language, it's Trump's language, not mine, which basically makes so clear this legacy. How could an American leader say this? Because it's being said and practiced for centuries in the United States. The idea that there are large numbers of people here, Native Americans, people of color, Hispanics, Africans, slaves. This was a huge percentage of people, and for the whole history of the country has been a debate about whether these people belong to the country, whether they really have any place here. And even the founding intellectuals of the country, the Jeffersons and the people, they were the largest slaveholders, and they never really believed that slaves could be integrated into American life in any kind of meaningful way. So there's a reason that Trump has a following, that he's speaking to this long-term history of kind of exterminism, of who is a true American. And it still resonates, particularly in a population that's feeling like they don't belong themselves. The white working class, for all the reasons we've been talking over and over about, they feel abandoned, they feel forgotten, they feel like, what was it that Hillary Clinton, they're deplorable.
Deplorables.
Right? Yeah, deplorable language. That has all accumulated, culturally and linguistically into a view, hey, who is it that really is going to be exterminated? Is it going to be me or them? And Trump is very persuasively sort of talking to those people who feel like, well, I am the true American. I'm a white, hardworking person. And it's very understandable why, given this history and given the economic circumstances they're facing, why they resonate to Trump's argument. Now, if they understood that Trump's language and rhetoric has never aligned, who did Trump really give his tax cuts to when he talks about tax cuts? He gave it to the deep state. He gave it to the corporate elites. About 80–90% of Trump tax cuts during the first term, they all went to the very rich. when you watch what Elon Musk and his friends, the billionaires who are now contributing, it's very wide open. Trump is saying, you give me $1 billion, I'll make sure you never pay taxes. Most of them don't pay taxes right now. Most billionaires do not pay taxes, any taxes, because they found an industry of wealth accountants and attorneys who have been able to disguise this money and put it in places that the IRS can never find. And so, I can very much understand why the ordinary worker city who's going to determine this election is thinking, is this about me or them? And Trump articulates that me versus them very, very powerfully. And the only way the Democrats can counter this is by making clear that all of us, those working people, those white working people, we don't see them as privileged people. We see them as suffering under the same yoke of big money that all the rest of Americans have, and that we have to unite together, or we're going to divide and kill each other off under a Trump kind of spirit.
Who Owns Democracy concludes with a chapter on how leftist movements can resist the deep state and the attacks on democracy. How do you think activists can most effectively challenge anti-democratic forces?
The last chapter of the book sort of takes the long history that we've described and sort of looks at what the prospects are for the future. And we've talked about some of this. We have, on the one hand, we've said that if you look through history, despite all the terrible weaknesses of shallow democracy and the limits on any kind of, in the face of big money and racial, extremism, there really has been an amazing effort to keep the struggle alive for the kind of democracy that was talked about but never practiced. So our view is, obviously Kamala Harris is running her whole campaign on that idea, that she alone will save the idea of democracy and the practice of democracy and move it into a new level. She said, let's move forward, let's move beyond these limitations and these divisions and unite around this idea of democracy. That's a powerful idea if it's taken seriously in practice. So the problem is that I think both Yale and I believe that she's pretty wedded to the war state that is so much a part of the current deep state. She's wedded to NATO. She's wedded to ongoing conflict with Russia, and that could easily lead to a nuclear war. And she's limited in her critique of American capitalism. She wants labor to have the organization. She wants a better deal for workers, but she's not likely. She's running very close to the center, hoping to pick up, the independents and some moderate Republicans who are not in favor of Trump. But the country is in an emergency. It's a climate emergency. It's an economic emergency. It's a military emergency. And, milquetoast in the center is not going to solve these problems. So, my own view is that whenever there's an emergency, the biggest economic emergency the country faced was during the Depression, where about a third of Americans were out of work. And the country mobilized and created the first real national labor movement. And you had hundreds of thousands of workers taking over factories. The government was creating new jobs, from planting trees to creating, the TVA, the public, energy. And we need a massive public investment in public goods, not just in the commodities that Yale was talking about, that suburbans were supposed to live a happy life around, the car, the best car, the biggest, it's not anymore possible to think a good life is the biggest life, living big as I can by having the biggest house, the biggest car, that's not going to cut it anymore. And I think a large number of young people are realizing that's the case. So we need a movement. And if you say, where is it going to come from? It's going to start with people voting for it. But it's going to start with a movement that says, we want a different kind of country where class and caste are being left behind, and we're going to sort of build a vision of a public collective kind of economy where ordinary people are going to have control. Co-ops are very popular in America. 75% of Americans, when surveyed, say they would love to work in a worker-owned company. Most Americans want to see more investment in social welfare. That's childcare, that's elder care, that's free higher education, the kinds of abundant, expansive social welfare that's common sense in France or Germany or Denmark. is something that's quite popular in the United States. And so I think that that idea, there are seeds of it in the American labor movement, among American young people, among people who are fed up with these wars that are absorbing so much of the capital in the country, and saying, let's take all this money that's building weapons and going to war and shift it over to an expansive public sphere where we can live in real cities, which have parks and gardens and public spaces and public facilities, which include colleges, clinics, all kinds of ordinary public facilities that are commonplace. Public transit, where people can go downtown, want to go downtown because there's something there, and can do it not with their cars, but with efficient, cheap public transit. That's a good way to start. You can go to European cities. Yale is going to Europe, to Italy, where more people than anywhere in the world, they go to Italy, and they have great public transit and they have great public services. I was with my wife in Italy. She tripped over a chain where they used to, one of these old, from way back a few centuries, hit her head on the cobblestones, was bleeding, taken to a healthcare facility in Italy, treated with significant, fractures and potential head damage, treated completely free as a tourist by the Italian health system. And it's just a small measure of kind of how the idea in many European countries that healthcare is something that everybody deserves, because if one you shouldn't have to be wealthy to get the healthcare you need, but that everybody will be better off, and the whole country as a whole, if you have a healthcare system that's serving everybody. I think that idea, Bernie Sanders talks about it all the time. A large sector of Democrats talk about this idea all the time, that things like education and higher education, and I have students from Europe who go to the best universities in Europe and are paying nothing. My students who are paying almost $100,000 a year to go to an expensive private school at the United States are going free to very good universities in Copenhagen or Berlin or Paris. So I think that these ideas, I find this among my own students, and surveys document this, they support the idea that we should end this obsession with commodities and everything being private and moving toward a shared kind of wealth. After all, who created the wealth of America? It was a shared creation by the workers of America. Let's give it back to us. Let's take it back because we created it, right? The 1% of the 1% who are reaping the profits. They got their wealth from all the workers who collectively created it. And I think the idea, and again, you can go to polls at it, the idea that this wealth should go back to the people in the form of expanded rights. Kamala was talking about freedom. This is not just freedom from, like the freedom to keep the government out of your bedroom. It's also freedom for. It's positive freedom, freedom to have healthcare, freedom to have education. This is built into the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights, which was founded by she wrote it pretty much, Eleanor Roosevelt, during the 30s. Again, a lot of these great global ideas of positive freedom, collective good, have been built by Americans, and so there is that whole historical legacy to build on that I feel is still worth pursuing and fighting for.
Obviously, what you need to do is create a sense that people of color, people from different ethnicities, are not the enemies. They are your allies. Now, ironically, I'm going to talk about somebody who I despise, somebody who I believe was the worst war criminal since Hitler, Nixon. But aside from that, Nixon proposed a very different system. In America, social services are means tested, and you have to fall into certain categories to qualify. Affirmative action says if you are Black, you are entitled to compensation that if you're white, you don't get. It says that if your income exceeds a certain level, you get no social services. If you go to Europe, and it's imposed this, there's no means testing. Everything is universal. everyone gets it. It doesn't matter what your skin color is. There's no income threshold where you're automatically disqualified. If that were proposed, you could undermine the idea that anybody outside your category is your enemy. Now, I have to say something. In Europe, despite everything I just said, we're seeing a new xenophobia. We're seeing a new idea that there are people coming here who are not European, who don't belong. So the very things I'm saying America has and Europe does not are being reversed. And I can't blame corporations for that. There's a popular movement against those very things that I'm saying Europe has that America needs.
Yeah, let me add though that a qualifying factor that is that one, the corporate elites have moved, particularly in the German central banks, toward a kind of Reagan-esque kind of fiscal policy, which is very austere and creating a lot of new problems for German working people. And I mentioned the German central banks because they're the most powerful economic force in Europe. And so why is this relevant to the sort of rising far right in Europe? Once again, you're having leading economic powers in Europe tightening the screws on ordinary workers, particularly in Southern Europe, but across Europe, which, as we know, creates when you tighten the screws on ordinary working people, whether in the United States or in Europe, you create fertile ground for this kind of neo-fascist kind of politics, because people say, why am I suffering? And there are plenty of leaders who are willing to say, the reason you're suffering, it's those Middle Eastern immigrants or those Arab immigrants or those people coming across the Mexican border or coming across from Northern Africa. And so we're in this era where, as the global capital elites tighten the screws on ordinary working people, whether in the United States or Europe or elsewhere, you're creating the seedbed for this fascist kind of politics, which we saw very, very clearly in the 30s. That was not just in Germany or Italy, it was happening in Spain, it was happening around the world. There was a strong fascist movement in the 30s in the United States, which Rachel Maddow has documented in the MSNBC column in her book Prequel, which talks about the coup against the government by America First, the America First movement, which Trump is deliberately emulating now. So we've seen this global fascist trend before, and we know how to deal with it. The New Deal gave us some approach to that, and we ought to learn those lessons, which is why we wrote this book, and learn that history. So if you want to say, how do we prevent this fascism from resurfacing? We know exactly what you have to do to prevent it because there's a history of it. We know what worked and what didn't work. And so we think we just have to resurrect that. That's why we wrote this book, Who Owns Democracy, to say, look, there's some historical lessons that don't give any certainty, but it gives a pretty damn good guideline as to what you want to do if you really are worried about fascism in America.